Okay, we're here and we are reading Stalin, The Collected Works, Volume 1. We are all the way down on page 240. We're almost down to less than 100 pages left here, comrades. Coming down near the end of this first collected work. And today's work is The Class Struggle. 240 on the PDF, 219 on the physical copy. The Class Struggle. And of course, he starts with a quote by Karl Marx. Quote, "The unity of the bourgeoisie can be shaken only by the unity of the proletariat." Karl Marx. Present-day society is extremely complex. It is a motley patchwork of classes and groups. The big, middle, and petty bourgeoisie, the big, middle, and petty feudal landlords, journeymen, unskilled laborers, and skilled factory workers. The higher, middle, and lower clergy, the higher, middle, and minor bureaucracy, a heterogeneous intelligentsia, and other groups of a similar kind. Such is the motley picture our society presents. It is also obvious that the further society develops, the more clearly two main trends stand out in this complexity, and the more sharply this complex society divides up into two opposite camps: the capitalist camp and the proletarian camp. The January economic strikes, 1905, clearly showed that Russia is indeed divided into two camps. So don't deny being a campist. The November strikes on St. Petersburg, 1905, and the June-July strikes all over Russia, 1906, brought the leaders of the two camps into collision and thereby fully exposed the present-day class antagonisms. Since then, the capitalist class has been wide awake. In that camp, feverish and ceaseless preparations is going on. Local associations of capitalists are being formed. The local associations combine to form regional associations, and the regional associations combine in all Russian associations. Funds and newspapers are being started, and all Russian congresses and conferences of capitalists are being convened. Thus, the capitalists are organizing in a separate class with the object of curbing the proletariat. On the other hand, the proletarian camp is wide awake too. Here too, feverish preparations for the impending struggle are being made. In spite of persecution by the reaction, here too, local trade unions are being formed. The local unions combine to form regional unions. Trade union funds are being started, and trade union press is growing. And all Russian congresses and conferences of workers' unions are being held. It is evident that the proletarians are also organizing in a separate class with the object of curbing exploitation. There was a time when peace and quiet reigned in society. At that time, there was no sign of these classes and their class organizations. A struggle went on, that time too, of course, but that struggle bore a local and not a general class character. The capitalists had no associations of their own, and each capitalist was obliged to deal with his workers by themselves. Nor did the workers have any unions, and consequently, the workers in each factory were obliged to rely only on their strength. True, local social democratic organizations led the workers' economic struggle. But everybody will agree that this leadership was weak and casual. The social democratic organizations could scarcely cope with their own party affairs. The January economic strikes, however, marked a turning point. The capitalists got busy and began to organize local associations. The capitalist associations in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Riga, and other towns were brought into being by the January strikes. As regards the capitalists in the oil, manganese, coal, and sugar industries, they converted their old peaceful associations into fighting associations and began to fortify their positions. But the capitalists were not content with this, so they decided to form an all Russian association. And so, in March 1905, on the initiative of Morozov, they gathered at a General Congress in Moscow. That was the first time all Russian Congress of Capitalists. Here they concluded an agreement by which they pledged themselves not to make any concessions to the workers without previous arrangements among themselves, and, in extreme cases, to declare a lockout. And a lockout is a strike of employers during which the employers deliberately shut down their factories in order to break the resistance of the workers and to frustrate their demands. That was the starting point of a fierce struggle between the capitalists and the proletarians. It marked the opening of a series of big lockouts in Russia. To conduct a big struggle, a strong association is needed. And so the capitalists decided to meet once again to form a still more closely knit association. Thus, 3 months after the first Congress, in July 1905, the second All-Russian Congress of Capitalists was convened in Moscow. Here, they reaffirmed the resolutions of the first Congress, reaffirmed the necessity of lockouts, and elected a committee to draft the rules and to arrange for the convocation of another Congress. Meanwhile, the resolutions of the Congress were put into effect. Facts have shown that the capitalists are carrying out these resolutions to the letter. If you recall the lockouts the capitalists declared in Riga, Warsaw, Odessa, Moscow, and other large cities. If you recall the November days in St. Petersburg, when 72 capitalists threatened 200,000 St. Petersburg workers with a cruel lockout, then you will easily understand what a mighty force the All-Russian Association of Capitalists represents, and how punctuously they are carrying out the decisions of their association. Then after the Second Congress, the capitalists arranged another Congress in January 1906. And finally, in April this year, the All-Russian Inaugural Congress of Capitalists took place, at which uniform rules were adopted and a central bureau was elected. As the newspapers report, these rules have already been sanctioned by the government. Thus, there can be no doubt that the Russian big bourgeoisie is already organized in a separate class, that it has its own local, regional, and central organizations, and can rouse the capitalists of the whole Russia in conformity with a single plan. To reduce wages, lengthen the working day, weaken the proletariat, and smash its organizations. Such are the objects of the General Association of Capitalists. Meanwhile, the workers' trade union movement has been growing and developing. Here too, the influence of the January economic strikes 1905 made itself felt. The movement assumed a mass character. Its needs grew wider, and thus, in the course of time, it became evident that social democratic organizations could not conduct both party and trade union affairs. Something in the nature of a division of labor between the party and the trade unions was needed. Party affairs had to be directed by the party organizations, and trade union affairs by trade unions. And so, the organization of trade unions began. Trade unions were formed all over the country. In Moscow, St. Petersburg, Warsaw, Odessa, Riga, Kharkov, and Tiflis. True, the reactionaries placed obstacles in the way, but in spite of that, the needs of the movement gained the upper hand, and the unions grew in number. Still, the appearance of local unions was followed by the appearance of regional unions. And finally, things reached the stage when, in September last year, an all-Russian Congress of Trade Unions was convened. That was the first conference of workers' unions. The upshot of that conference was, among other things, that it drew together the unions in different towns, and finally elected a central bureau to prepare for the convocation of a general congress of trade unions. The October days arrived, and the trade unions became twice as strong as they were before. Local and finally regional unions grew day by day. True, the December defeat appreciably checked the rate of formation of trade unions, but later the trade union movement recovered and things went so well that in February of this year, the second conference of trade unions was called. And it was more widely and fully representative than the first conference. The conference recognized the necessity of forming local, regional, and all Russian centers, electing an organizing commission, to make arrangements for the forthcoming all-Russian Congress and passed appropriate resolutions on current questions affecting the trade union movement. Thus, there can be no doubt that, notwithstanding the reaction that is raging, the proletariat is also organizing in a separate class, is steadily strengthening its local, regional, and central trade union organizations, and is also steadily striving to unite its innumerable fellow workers against the capitalists. To secure higher wages, a shorter working day, better conditions of labor, to curb exploitation, and to thwart capitalist associations. Such are the objects of the workers' trade unions. Thus, present-day society is splitting up into two big camps. Each camp is organizing in a separate class. The class struggle that is flared up between them is expanding and growing more intense every day. And all other groups are gathering around these two camps. Marx said that every class struggle is a political struggle. This means that, if the proletarians and capitalists are waging an economic struggle against each other today, they will be compelled to wage a political struggle tomorrow, and thus protect their respective class interests in a struggle that bears two forms. The capitalists have their particular business interests, and it is to protect these interests that their economic organizations exist. But in addition to their particular business interests, they also have common class interests, namely, to strengthen capitalism. And it is to protect these common interests that they must wage a political struggle and need a political party. The Russian capitalists solved this problem very easily. They realized that the only party which straightforwardly and fearlessly champions their interests was the Octoberist Party. And they therefore resolved to rally around that party and to accept its ideological leadership. Since then, the capitalists have been waging their political struggle under the ideological leadership of this party. With its aid, they exert influence on the present government, which suppresses the workers' unions but hastens to sanction the formation of capitalist associations. They secure the election of its candidates to the Duma, etc., etc. Less Stalin, more Stalin. Thus, economic struggle with the aid of associations and general political struggle under the ideological leadership of the Octoberist Party, that is, the form of class struggle waged by the big bourgeoisie, is assuming today. On the other hand, similar phenomena are also observed in the proletarian class movement today. To protect the trade interests of the proletarians' trade unions are being formed, and these fight for higher wages, a shorter working day, etc. But in addition to trade interests, the proletarians have also common class interests, namely the socialist revolution and the establishment of socialism. It is impossible, however, to achieve the socialist revolution until the proletariat conquers political power as a united and indivisible class. That is why the proletariat must wage the political struggle. That is why it needs a political party that will act as the ideological leader of the political movement. Most of the workers' unions are, of course, non-party and neutral. But this merely means that they are independent of the party only in financial and organizational matters, i.e., they have their own separate funds, their own leading bodies, call their own Congress, and officially are not bound by the decisions of political parties. As regards the ideological dependence of trade unions upon any given political party, such dependence must undoubtedly exist and cannot help existing. Because, apart from everything else, members of different parties belong to the unions and inevitably carry out their political convictions into them. Clearly, the proletariat cannot dispense with the political struggle. It cannot dispense with the ideological leadership of some political party. More than that, it must itself seek a party which will worthily lead its unions to the promised land, to socialism. But here, the proletariat must be on the alert and act with circumspection. It must carefully examine the ideological stock in trade of the political parties and freely accept the ideological leadership of the party that will courageously and consistently champion its class interests. Hold aloft the red flag of the proletariat and boldly lead it to political power, to the socialist revolution. That's your criteria for supporting a party, right there. Until now, this role has been carried out by the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Consequently, it is the task of the trade unions to accept its ideological leadership. It is common knowledge that they actually do so. Thus, economic clashes with the aid of trade unions, political attacks under the ideological leadership of social democracy, that is, the form of class struggle of the proletariat has assumed today. And this is why, by the way, trade unions are no longer the same vessel that they were in this time. Because they don't have that leadership behind a revolutionary organization anymore. That's mass organizations, street organizations that do now. And communist parties in the West, in advanced capitalist countries, have to learn to accept this and organize accordingly. Thus, economic clashes with the aid of trade unions, political attacks under the ideological leadership of social democracy, that is the form of class struggle the proletariat has assumed today. And again, we're still 1906 right now, or so. There can be no doubt that the class struggle will flare up with increasing vigor. The task of the proletariat is to introduce the system and the spirit of organization into its struggle. To accomplish this, it is necessary to strengthen the unions and to unite them. And in this, the All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions can render a great service. Not a non-party's worker congress, but a congress of workers' trade unions is what we need today, in order that the proletariat shall be organized in a united and indivisible class. At the same time, the proletariat must exert every effort to strengthen and fortify the party, which will act as the ideological and political leader of its class struggle. Akalia Droyebia, The New Times. 279. We got a thing here. So the New Times is a trade union weekly newspaper published legally in Georgian language in Tiflis from November 14, 1906 to January 8, 1907, under the directorship of J.V. Stalin, M. Takshiaka, and M. Davidshvili. It was suppressed by the order of the governor of Tiflis. There you go. The New Times, November 14th, 1906. Signed, Co. Translated from Georgian.